At 0553 hours on October 5, 1943, Robert Duncan sat in the cockpit of his F6F Hellcat on the rain-soaked deck of the USS Yorktown, watching the pre-dawn darkness swallow the aircraft ahead of him as they launched into the storm. The target was Wake Island. Japanese fighters would be waiting. Duncan was 22 years old, a small-town boy from Illinois who had learned to fly less than 2 years earlier. His hands gripped the control stick. His flight suit was already damp from the rain blowing across the flight deck. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine roared with 2,000 horsepower. The deck crew gave the signal. Duncan pushed the throttle forward and felt the Hellcat throw him back into his seat as it hurtled down the deck and into the black sky. What would happen in the next 30 minutes would mark the beginning of the end for the most feared fighter in the Pacific. For 18 months, the Mitsubishi A6M0 had terrorized American pilots across the Pacific theater. From Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, from Wake Island to the Dutch East Indies, the Zero had dominated every engagement it encountered. It was faster than anything the Americans flew. It could climb higher. It could turn tighter. It could stay in the air longer. Japanese engineers had achieved something remarkable in aircraft design. A carrier-based fighter that could outperform land-based aircraft. A plane so light and agile that it seemed to defy the laws of physics. The Zero achieved a kill ratio of 12-1 against Chinese pilots during the war in Asia. Over Salomon in April of 1942, 36 Zeros engaged 60 British aircraft and shot down 27 of them. They lost a single plane. At Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, 78 Zeros escorted the bombers that devastated the Pacific Fleet. 9 were shot down, mostly by anti-aircraft fire, but the Japanese losses seemed trivial compared to what their bombers accomplished. The aircraft proved nearly untouchable in air-to-air combat. American pilots learned to fear the Zero with genuine dread. The official doctrine taught to every fighter pilot was simple and unambiguous. Do not engage a Zero if you can avoid it. If a Zero gets on your tail, dive away immediately. Do not try to turn with it. Do not try to outclimb it. Run. Hope your aircraft's armor holds. Hope you can reach your carrier before he catches you. Hope you survive. The Grumman F4F Wildcat was the Navy's frontline fighter when the war began in December 1941. It was tough and reliable, a sturdy aircraft built with heavy construction that pilots called the Grumman Ironworks product because of its rugged, blocky design. But it could not match the Zero in speed, climb rate, or maneuverability. Wildcat pilots survived by working in carefully coordinated pairs, using a defensive maneuver invented by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch, called the Thatch Weave. The tactic allowed wingmen to protect each other by providing mutual cover when a Zero attempted to attack. 2 Wildcats flying in formation could protect each other in ways a single fighter could not. They survived by refusing to fight on Japanese terms. But survival was not victory, and by mid-1942, the Navy knew with absolute certainty that it needed something better, something faster, something that could turn with a Zero, something that could kill a Zero. The problem was not that American engineers did not know how to build fast aircraft. They knew. The Vought F4U Corsair was already in development, and it would eventually become one of the finest fighters of the war. But American planners faced a fundamental obstacle. The Zero was a mystery. Its performance specifications were classified by the Japanese. Its design philosophy was unknown to American military intelligence. Its construction techniques were secret. American pilots who survived encounters with it could describe its capabilities in general terms, but they could not explain how the Japanese had achieved them. They could not identify its weaknesses because they did not know it had any. The Zero seemed invincible. It seemed to be the perfect fighter aircraft. Then, on June 4, 1942, a 19-year-old Japanese pilot named Tadayoshi Koga took off from the aircraft carrier Ryujo to attack Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands. His mission was part of a diversionary operation designed to draw American attention away from the main Japanese thrust toward Midway Island. Koga and his two wingmen, Chief Petty Officer Makoto Endo and Petty Officer Tsuguo Shikata, attacked Dutch Harbor and strafed American positions on the ground. During the raid, Koga's Zero took hits from American ground fire. Oil began leaking from the engine. The aircraft could still fly, but not for long. The engine was deteriorating. Koga knew he could not make it back to the carrier. He turned toward Akutan Island, approximately 20 miles east of Dutch Harbor, where the Japanese had designated an emergency landing strip. A submarine waited offshore to pick up any downed pilots and rescue them from the water. The strip looked solid from the air. Long grass covered the surface. The terrain appeared flat and suitable for a wheels-down landing. It looked perfect for bringing in an aircraft with engine damage. It was not what it appeared. Beneath the grass lay a bog, soft mud hidden by the vegetation that grew in the wetland environment. When Koga lowered his landing gear and touched down, the wheels sank immediately into the saturated ground. The Zero flipped onto its back and slid to a stop in the marsh. Koga's neck broke on impact. He died instantly. He was 19 years old. He would never know what his death would mean for the war. His wingmen circled overhead, watching the disaster unfold below them. They had standing orders to destroy any downed Zero to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. Standard procedure in all air forces, but they could not be certain Koga was dead. Canopy was intact. The aircraft looked undamaged except for its inverted position. They could not bring themselves to strafe their friend's aircraft. They circled twice, hoping against logic that he had somehow survived the crash, and turned back toward the carrier with heavy hearts. The Zero sat in the bog upside down, largely intact. Rain fell on it. The Aleutian fog wrapped around it. Birds landed on its overturned belly. No Japanese recovery team came. No Japanese pilot returned to destroy it. It sat there for 5 weeks in the harsh Aleutian environment, exposed to the elements, weathering the constant rain and wind. Then, on July 10, 1942, a Navy PBY Catalina patrol plane piloted by Lieutenant William Thies was flying over the Aleutians when his crew chief, machinist mate Albert Knack, spotted something strange below. A gray shape in the marsh on Akutan Island, something that did not belong in the natural landscape. They circled lower, dropped beneath the clouds. It was an aircraft. Japanese markings were visible even through the mud and weathering. Thies radioed the sighting immediately. Within days, a salvage team was on the island. They found Koga's body still in the cockpit, preserved by the cold climate. They buried him nearby with military honors and respect, acknowledging the professionalism of a fellow pilot. Then they began the work of extracting the Zero from the mud. The recovery was not easy. The bog did not want to give up its prize. Specialized equipment had to be brought in by ship. The aircraft had to be carefully raised without causing additional damage to the already compromised structure. It took weeks of difficult work in harsh weather, but by early August, the Zero was on a ship bound for San Diego, California. Navy mechanics at North Island in San Diego worked around the clock to restore the captured aircraft to flying condition. The damage was surprisingly minor, considering the crash and 5-week exposure to the elements. The tail needed straightening. The wingtips required repair work. The propeller needed rebuilding. The landing gear had to be completely reconstructed. But the engine was intact. The airframe was structurally sound. The flight control surfaces functioned. Within weeks, they had a flyable Zero. On September 20, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Eddie Sanders climbed into the cockpit of the restored aircraft and took off for the first of 24 test flights. He flew it for 25 days straight, pushing the aircraft to its limits, measuring its performance against every parameter, documenting everything. What Sanders discovered in those flights would change the Pacific War. The Zero was not invincible. It was a brilliant design built around a fatal compromise. The Japanese had sacrificed everything for performance. No armor plating protected the pilot's body. No self-sealing material lined the fuel tanks. The airframe was light to the point of fragility. Hit a Zero with a solid burst of 50s caliber fire, and it would come apart. Set its fuel tanks ablaze, and the pilot had no chance of survival. The aircraft would transform into a fireball, and it had weaknesses that American pilots could exploit if they knew to look for them. Sanders found that above 200 knots airspeed, the Zero's ailerons became almost impossible to move. The control forces increased dramatically at high speed, making the aircraft sluggish in roll. At 250 knots, the aircraft could barely roll at all. He found that it rolled more easily to the left than to the right, probably due to propeller torque effects. He found that the engine's float-type carburetor would cut out under negative acceleration, meaning that if a Zero tried to follow an American aircraft into a steep dive, its engine would sputter and die. The pilot would lose engine power at the critical moment. These weaknesses were not theoretical abstractions. They were operationally exploitable. An American pilot who knew about them could escape a Zero on his tail. He could dive away at high speed, building past 200 knots, where the Zero's roll rate fell off dramatically. He could roll hard to the right, forcing the Zero to execute its weaker maneuver. He could push into negative G forces, cutting his own engine briefly, but knowing the Zero's engine would cut out too, and for longer. The information from the Akutan Zero was compiled into technical reports that were distributed throughout the fleet. Intelligence Summary 59, Technical Aviation Intelligence Brief Number 3, Tactical and Technical Trends Number 5. Pilots memorized the findings. Dive away, roll right. Negative G, do not turn, do not climb, exploit the weaknesses. But there was a problem. The information from the Akutan Zero came too late to influence the design of America's next great fighter. That aircraft was already flying. The Grumman F6F Hellcat had been on the drawing board since before Pearl Harbor. Throughout early 1942, Leroy Grumman and his chief designers, Jake Svertbeck and Bill Schwendler, had been working with the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics to develop a replacement for the Wildcat. They knew the new fighter needed to be bigger, faster, and more powerful than the Wildcat. They knew it needed to climb better and roll faster. They knew it needed to protect its pilots with armor plating and self-sealing fuel tanks. What they did not know initially was exactly what kind of performance they needed to achieve. They did not have hard numbers on the Zero's capabilities. They had only the reports of pilots who had fought it and survived, reports that were sometimes contradictory and always incomplete. Then those pilots started coming home, and they started talking directly to the engineers. On April 21, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare received the Medal of Honor at the White House in Washington, D.C. O'Hare had become a national hero 2 months earlier when he single-handedly attacked 9 Japanese Mitsubishi G4M Betty bombers that were threatening the aircraft carrier Lexington. His wingman's guns had jammed. The rest of his flight was out of position. O'Hare was alone against 9 enemy bombers. He attacked anyway. In 4 minutes, he shot down 5 bombers and damaged a 6th, breaking up the attack and saving the Lexington from certain damage and possible destruction. He had used just 60 rounds per kill, a display of marksmanship that amazed even experienced pilots. It was, the Navy declared, one of the most daring single actions in the history of combat aviation. President Franklin Roosevelt presided over the ceremony at the White House. He asked O'Hare's wife, Rita, to place the medal around her husband's neck. Then Roosevelt asked him a question that would shape the future of American naval aviation. What did American pilots need most in a new fighter aircraft? O'Hare did not hesitate. "A plane that will go upstairs faster," he said simply. "Something that can climb. Give us an aircraft that can climb, and we can beat them." The next day, April 22, 1942, O'Hare visited the Grumman Aircraft Factory in Bethpage, Long Island, New York. He spent hours with the engineers, describing what it was like to fight the Japanese. He told them about the Zero's exceptional climb rate, its turning ability, its acceleration in certain flight regimes. He told them about the Wildcat's limitations, where it fell short, where pilots felt most vulnerable in combat. He told them what American pilots needed to survive and win. Lieutenant Commander A.M. Jackson from the Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics was there as well. He emphasized something that O'Hare had demonstrated in his Medal of Honor action. "You cannot hit them if you cannot see them," Jackson told the designers. The new fighter needed better visibility from the cockpit. The pilot needed to be able to see behind him, below him, in every direction. The pilot's perspective needed to be expanded. Grumman listened. They redesigned the cockpit, mounting it higher in the fuselage to improve the pilot's vantage point. They sloped the forward fuselage down toward the engine cowling, giving the pilot an unobstructed view over the nose of the aircraft. They enlarged the canopy and gave it a bubble shape that would become one of the most distinctive features of the design. 4 days after O'Hare's visit, the Bureau of Aeronautics made another decision that would change the war. They ordered Grumman to replace the planned engine with something more powerful than the original design specification. The original design had called for a Wright R1820 Cyclone producing 1,700 horsepower. It was a good engine, proven and reliable in many aircraft, but it was not enough for what the Navy required. The new engine would be the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, 2,000 horsepower, 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows. The same powerful engine that was already selected to power the Army's P-47 Thunderbolt and the Navy's F-4U Corsair. It was the most powerful engine available for American fighters, and Grumman was going to put it in their new plane. The decision required significant redesign of the airframe. The structure had to be strengthened to handle the additional power. The engine mount had to be rebuilt. The fuel system had to be upgraded. The cooling systems required modification. But Grumman's engineers worked fast. They had been building aircraft for the Navy since 1931. They knew what the service needed, and they knew how to deliver it. On June 26, 1942, the first prototype Hellcat, designated XF6F1, took to the sky with test pilot Robert Hall at the controls. It flew well enough, demonstrating good basic handling characteristics. But the 1,700 horsepower engine was clearly inadequate. The Navy wanted more power. On July 30th, barely a month later, the redesigned prototype with the double Wasp engine flew for the first time. The transformation was remarkable. The XF6F3, as it was now designated, was 25% faster than the original design. It could climb at 3,300 feet per minute, faster than any American fighter before it. It reached a top speed of 375 miles per hour, and it could take punishment that would destroy a Zero. The Hellcat was built like a tank. 212 pounds of armor protected the cockpit and engine. Steel plates surrounded the pilot's seat. A bullet-resistant windshield shielded him from frontal fire. The engine had its own armor protecting the oil cooler. Self-sealing fuel tanks would swell shut if punctured by enemy fire, preventing the catastrophic fires that had killed so many Zero pilots. The wings spanned over 36 feet, spanning nearly 34 square feet of wing area, nearly a third larger than the Wildcats. That enormous wing area gave the Hellcat exceptional lift and maneuverability for its size. It meant the aircraft could operate at lower speeds without stalling. It meant carrier landings were easier and safer. 6 50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns protruded from the wings, 3 on each side. Each gun fired at a rate of approximately 800 rounds per minute. Together, they could put out nearly 80 rounds per second. A 2-second burst would send over 150 bullets downrange. Grumman built the Hellcat to be tough, simple, and easy to maintain in the harsh environment of carrier operations. They built it to survive hard landings on pitching flight decks. They built it to withstand rough handling by flight deck crews working in impossible conditions. They built it to resist the corrosive salt air of the Pacific Ocean that could destroy lesser aircraft in months. They built it to bring pilots home alive. Leroy Grumman's design philosophy was clear from the beginning. Give the pilot every advantage, protect him with armor, arm him with overwhelming firepower. Let him survive his mistakes. Let him come back to fight again. This philosophy stood in sharp contrast to Japanese thinking. The Zero had been designed for performance above all else. Armor was considered unnecessary weight. Firepower could be sacrificed for speed and maneuverability. Survivability was not a primary design objective. Japanese pilots were expected to be skilled enough not to get hit. American designers made the opposite assumption. American pilots would get hit. They would get damaged. The aircraft needed to protect them and let them come home. The first production F6F rolled off the assembly line in October 1942. Grumman had built a new factory, Plant Number 3, specifically for Hellcat production. They had trouble finding structural steel during wartime shortages, so they bought scrap metal from the demolished 2nd Avenue Elevated Railway in New York City. The joke went around the factory that the steel had not gone into making the facility, but into making Hellcats. The aircraft were practically made of subway tracks. It was a way to maintain production when material shortages threatened to halt the entire program. By early 1943, the planes were reaching operational squadrons. Fighting Squadron 9, redesignated VF9, received the first Hellcats in January 1943. Butch O'Hare's squadron, now redesignated Fighting Squadron 6, received theirs shortly after. Training began immediately as pilots who had flown Wildcats had to learn the capabilities and characteristics of this new, more powerful aircraft. By summer of 1943, the aircraft were heading to the Pacific, loaded aboard carriers bound for combat zones. The Hellcat's first combat mission came on August 31, 1943, when aircraft from the carriers USS Yorktown, USS Essex, and USS Independence attacked Marcus Island, a Japanese outpost less than 1,000 miles from Tokyo. Commander Charles Crommelin led VF-5. Lieutenant Commander Phil Torrey led VF-9. A detachment of O'Hare's VF-6 participated in the attack as well. The early morning raiders caught the Japanese by surprise. They destroyed 8 twin-engine bombers on the ground before the enemy could get them airborne. Anti-aircraft fire was intense. 2 Hellcats were damaged, 1 shot down by ground fire. Another pilot crashed from engine trouble. But no Hellcats were lost to Japanese fighters because there were no Japanese fighters present. The enemy had not expected an attack on Marcus Island. The island's garrison was stunned by the sudden appearance of American aircraft. The next day, over Howland and Baker Islands, Lieutenant Richard Lowe and Lieutenant Junior Grade Austin W. Nyquist scored the Hellcats' first aerial victory when they teamed up to shoot down a Japanese Kawanishi H-8K Emily reconnaissance aircraft. The Emily was a large 4-engine flying boat used by the Japanese Navy for long-range patrol and reconnaissance missions. It was not a fighter aircraft, and it carried none of the speed and maneuverability that had made the Zero so dangerous. The kill did not prove the Hellcat could defeat the Zero in air combat. That was still an open question. But the true test would come 5 weeks later. At Wake Island, in the rain, in the dark, against the aircraft the Hellcat had been designed to destroy, Robert Duncan climbed through the storm clouds, his engine howling with the power of 2,000 horses, his instruments barely visible in the pre-dawn blackness. He was part of a fighter sweep ahead of the main strike force. Their job was to clear the sky of Japanese fighters before the bombers arrived and dropped their ordnance on the island. Duncan had advantages that fighter pilots earlier in the war could only dream of. His commanding officer, his operations officer, and his gunnery officer had all studied the captured Akutan Zero. They had participated in test flights with the restored aircraft. They had shared what they learned with every pilot in the squadron. Duncan knew the Zero's weaknesses in intimate detail. He knew how to exploit them, and he was flying an aircraft that had been designed from the ground up, based on hard combat experience, to beat it. The rain hammered against his canopy with relentless force. Visibility was nearly zero. Duncan could barely see the aircraft ahead of him. He flew on instruments, trusting his training, trusting the 2,000 horsepower engine pulling him through the clouds at a rate of climb that would have astonished pilots from just a year earlier. The Hellcat climbed steadily, eating altitude with every minute. Then he was through. Above the storm, the sky was clear. Stars still glittered overhead. The eastern horizon glowed with the first light of dawn, and there, silhouetted against that glow, was a Japanese Zero. The Zero pilot had not seen him. Duncan had the advantage of position, the advantage of surprise, the advantage of altitude. He had everything a fighter pilot could ask for. He pushed the stick forward and dove. The Hellcat accelerated faster than any aircraft Duncan had ever flown. The double Wasp engine roared with power. The airspeed indicator climbed past 300 knots, past 350, past 400 knots. The slipstream screamed past the canopy like a living thing. The Zero grew larger in his gun sight. Duncan squeezed the trigger. 6 50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. Tracers reached out across the sky, bright lines of fire in the pre-dawn darkness, converging on the Japanese fighter. The Zero came apart under the impact. Duncan saw pieces fly off the wings. He saw the aircraft begin to tumble uncontrollably. He saw it disappear below him, trailing smoke like a wounded bird. He pulled up and climbed back to altitude, scanning for more targets. One kill. His first. But there were more Zeros in the sky. Duncan spotted a second one below him, turning hard in a steep bank to engage another Hellcat. The Japanese pilot had not seen Duncan diving toward him. He was focused entirely on his target, committed to his attack run. Duncan rolled into a dive, building speed, lining up the shot carefully. At the last moment, the Zero pilot saw him coming. He broke off his attack and pulled into a vertical climb straight up, using the Zero's legendary climb rate to escape the threat. It was a tactic that had killed dozens of American pilots over the past 18 months. Japanese pilots had perfected it. You lure a Wildcat into a climbing fight. The Zero could outclimb anything in the American inventory. When the Wildcat stalled out and fell away, you rolled over and dove down for the kill. Simple, deadly, reliable. It had worked against Wildcats for 2 years. It had worked against this very pilot, Warrant Officer Toshuki Sueda, 9 times before. Sueda had 9 American kills to his name, 9 pilots who had made the mistake of trying to climb with him. He had every reason to believe it would work again. But Duncan was not flying a Wildcat. The Hellcat followed Sueda into the climb. Its 2,000 horsepower engine clawed at the sky with tremendous power. Its massive wings bit into the thin air at altitude. The aircraft did not stall. It did not fall away. It kept climbing, gaining on the Zero with every second that passed. Sueda reached the top of his arc and rolled over, expecting to see the American fighter falling away below him, helpless, an easy kill. Instead, he saw the Hellcat right behind him, still climbing, still gaining, guns coming to bear. Duncan pressed the trigger. The Hellcat bucked as 6 guns fired simultaneously. Tracers converged on the Zero. Sueda's aircraft came apart in mid-air. The fuselage separated from the wings. Fire erupted from the fuel tanks in a catastrophic explosion. Debris scattered across the sky in a wide pattern. Duncan flew through the wreckage and kept climbing, searching for more targets. 2 Zeros destroyed in rapid succession. The first Hellcat kills against the aircraft that had terrorized the Pacific for 18 months. And one of those kills was a 9 Victory ace, one of Japan's experienced combat pilots. Toshiuki Sueda had perfected the vertical climb tactic that had killed American pilots repeatedly. Now he was dead, killed by an aircraft that could climb with him and fight him on equal terms. The message was clear. The Zero's reign over the Pacific skies was over. News of Duncan's victory spread through the fleet like wildfire. Pilots talked about it in ready rooms where they prepared for missions. Officers discussed it in wardrooms. Flight deck crews shared the story on the hangar deck. The Hellcat could climb with a zero. The Hellcat could kill a zero. The rules had changed. But Duncan's fight was just the beginning of what would become the systematic destruction of Japanese air power. On November 23, 1943, Hellcats from multiple carriers engaged Japanese fighters over Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands. The battle raged for 2 days as American forces stormed the beaches below. In the sky above, Hellcats tore into zero formations with devastating effect. Lieutenant Junior Grade Ralph Hanks shot down 5 Zeros in 5 minutes, becoming an instant ace. Other pilots added to the tally throughout the day. When the fighting ended, American pilots claimed 30 Zeros destroyed. Only one Hellcat was lost to enemy action. The kill ratio was 30-1. The mathematics were staggering. Over Rabaul on November 11th, Hellcats and F4U Corsairs fought running battles with Japanese aircraft all day. Nearly 50 enemy aircraft were claimed destroyed. Rabaul, the Japanese fortress that had dominated the South Pacific for 2 years, was being systematically destroyed from the air. American fighters now owned the sky. On December 4, 1943, over Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, 91 Hellcats engaged 50 Zeros in one of the largest air battles of the Pacific War. The fighting was intense. Zeros and Hellcats swirled through the sky in a massive dogfight. When it ended, the Americans had shot down 28 Zeros. They had lost 2 Hellcats to enemy action, 14-1. Something fundamental had changed. The Zero was no longer the hunter. It was becoming the prey. Japanese pilots noticed the shift almost immediately. Flight reports from late 1943 began describing American fighters that behaved differently than before. They were more aggressive. They engaged in turning fights that would have been suicide against the Zero a year earlier. They climbed when attacked, instead of diving away. They fought like pilots who knew they had the superior aircraft because they did. The Hellcat was faster than the Zero at all altitudes. Above 14,000 feet, it could outclimb the Zero. Above 235 miles per hour, it could outroll the Zero. It could dive faster without structural damage. It could pull out of dives harder without ripping its wings off. It could absorb punishment that would have destroyed the unarmored Japanese fighter. Its 650 caliber guns delivered devastating firepower compared to the Zero's armament of 2 rifle-caliber machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. The Zero's cannons were slow-firing, limited to 60 rounds each, and had a low muzzle velocity that made accurate shooting difficult at distance. The Hellcat's guns had no such limitations. They could pour fire into a target until it ceased to exist. More importantly, the Hellcat could take hits that would have destroyed the Zero. American pilots discovered they could absorb enemy fire, keep fighting, and still make it back to the carrier. Hellcats returned to their ships with dozens of bullet holes, with shattered canopies, with chunks of wing missing, with engines coughing smoke and fire. They landed on the carrier, were repaired overnight by the maintenance crews, and flew again the next morning. Japanese pilots had no such luxury. A single burst of 50 caliber fire into a Zero's unprotected fuel tanks would turn it into a fireball. A few hits to the engine would send it spinning into the sea. The plane that had been designed for performance above all else was paying the price for that philosophy. By early 1944, the kill ratios were becoming impossible to ignore. American pilots were destroying Japanese aircraft at rates that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. And the losses were not just in aircraft, they were in pilots. Japan had begun the war with a corps of highly trained, experienced naval aviators. Many had been flying combat missions since the war with China in the late 1930s. They were skilled, aggressive, and confident in their abilities. But 2 years of continuous combat had taken a terrible toll. The battles of the Coral Sea, Midway, the Solomon Islands, the Central Pacific. Each engagement killed more of Japan's experienced pilots, and Japan could not replace them. American training programs could turn out hundreds of new pilots every month. The facilities existed. The instructors existed. The fuel existed. The aircraft existed. Japanese training programs were far more limited. Fuel shortages forced them to cut training hours. Instructor shortages meant lessons went untaught. Experienced pilots were being lost faster than they could be trained. The new pilots being rushed to combat in 1944 had a fraction of the training their predecessors had received. When these inexperienced pilots climbed into their Zeros to face the Hellcat, they did not stand a chance. The true measure of the Hellcat's dominance would come in June of 1944, in a battle that would break the back of Japanese naval aviation forever. By mid-1944, the war in the Pacific had reached a critical phase. American forces were pushing toward the Mariana Islands, a chain of strategic outposts that included Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The Marianas were only 1,200 nautical miles from Tokyo. If the Americans captured them, B-29 Superfortress bombers would be within range of the Japanese home islands. The strategic bombing campaign that would devastate Japanese cities could begin. Japanese military planners understood this with complete clarity. The fate of the empire rested on stopping the American advance. Admiral Soyoda, commander of the combined fleet, declared that the coming battle would be decisive. He committed nearly every available carrier and aircraft to stopping the American invasion. It would be the decisive engagement that Japanese strategists had dreamed of since the war began. One massive battle that would destroy American naval power and turn the tide of the entire war. On June 15, 1944, American troops landed on Saipan. 4 days later, Japanese scouts reported the American carrier fleet steaming west of the island. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese First Mobile Fleet, moved to intercept. Ozawa had 9 aircraft carriers, 5 fleet carriers, and 4 light carriers. He had 5 battleships, 12 cruisers, and 22 destroyers. He had over 400 carrier-based aircraft and could call on an additional 200 land-based planes from airfields in the Marianas. Facing him was Task Force 58 under Vice Admiral Mark Mitchell. 15 carriers, 7 fleet carriers, and 8 light carriers, 7 battleships, 8 heavy cruisers, 13 light cruisers, 58 destroyers, and nearly 900 aircraft. It was the largest carrier battle in history. The fate of the Pacific War would be decided in the next 2 days. The battle began at 1,000 hours on June 19th, when American radar detected the first wave of Japanese aircraft approaching from the west. The Japanese had launched their strike at extreme range, counting on their aircraft's superior endurance to reach the American fleet and return safely. They expected to catch the Americans by surprise. They were profoundly wrong. American radar had detected them at 150 miles out. The fighters were already climbing to intercept. The Japanese had launched over 300 aircraft in 4 massive waves. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedo planes, everything they could muster. The Hellcats were waiting for them. Lieutenant Alexander Vrasiu was flying combat air patrol over Task Force 58 when the call came. Bogies inbound, large formation, all fighters intercept. Vrasiu pushed his throttle forward and climbed to intercept the enemy. He was 25 years old, born in East Chicago, Indiana, to Romanian immigrant parents. He had learned to fly through the civilian pilot training program before the war and had enlisted in the Navy in October 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor. Vrasiu had served under Butch O'Hare himself. O'Hare had made him his wingman and taught him everything he knew about aerial combat. He had shown him how to approach a target, how to conserve ammunition, how to survive. O'Hare had been killed 7 months earlier during a night fighter mission, shot down by Japanese bombers in the darkness, but his lessons lived on in pilots like Vrasiu. As Vrasiu climbed, his engine began to sputter. The supercharger was malfunctioning. He could not get above 20,000 feet. The Japanese bombers were coming in at 20,000 feet. Any other pilot might have turned back, reported the mechanical problem, and let someone else handle the interception. Vrasiu kept climbing. He was not going to miss this fight. Then he saw them, a massive formation of Japanese aircraft stretching across the sky in a wide pattern. Yokosuka D-4Y Judy dive bombers, slim and fast, carrying bombs under their bellies. Zeros weaving through the formation, providing escort. They were heading straight for the American fleet below. Vrasiu pushed his struggling Hellcat into a dive. He picked out a Judy at the back of the formation and opened fire. The bomber exploded. He pulled up, rolled, acquired another target, and dove again. Another Judy came apart under his guns, a third, a fourth, a fifth. The formation was breaking. Up. Japanese bombers were scattering in all directions, trying to escape, jettisoning their bombs into the sea to lighten their load. Vrasiu stayed with them. He was not going to let them reach the fleet. He lined up a sixth Judy and pressed the trigger. The bomber's bomb detonated in mid-air from the gunfire. The explosion was so close that Vrasiu felt his Hellcat shudder from the blast. Debris flew past his canopy. For a moment, he thought he had been hit, but the Hellcat kept flying. It always kept flying. 6 kills in 8 minutes. 360 rounds of ammunition, an average of 60 rounds per kill, the same deadly accuracy that Butch O'Hare had displayed 2 years earlier. When Vrasiu landed on the USS Lexington, he climbed out of his cockpit and looked up at Admiral Mitchell on the bridge. He held up 6 gloved fingers. Mitchell smiled. A photographer captured the moment. The image of Vrasiu grinning, holding up 6 fingers, became one of the most famous photographs of the Pacific War. But Vrasiu was just one pilot among hundreds. All across the sky over the Philippine Sea, Hellcat pilots were tearing into the Japanese formations with devastating effectiveness. Commander David McCampbell, leading Air Group 15 from the carrier USS Essex, shot down 7 Japanese aircraft that day. McCampbell was 34 years old, ancient for a fighter pilot. He had survived the sinking of the carrier USS Wasp 2 years earlier and had spent time as a landing signal officer before finally getting his chance to command a fighter squadron. When the Japanese attacked, McCampbell led his fighters into the enemy formation and did not stop killing until his guns were empty. 7 confirmed victories in a single day. It would not be his last record-breaking performance. Pilot after pilot returned to their carriers, reported their kills, refueled, rearmed, and launched again. The Japanese kept coming. 4 waves of aircraft, one after another, and wave after wave was destroyed. Some Japanese bombers got through the fighter screen. A few reached the fleet. One bomb hit the battleship USS South Dakota. A few torpedoes were dropped. None hit anything. Meanwhile, American submarines stalked the Japanese fleet. The USS Albacore torpedoed the carrier Taiho, Ozawa's flagship. The USS Kavala hit the Shokaku, a veteran of Pearl Harbor. Both carriers would sink before the day was over. By the end of June 19th, the Japanese had lost over 340 carrier aircraft. 315 of the 423 that had launched that morning were destroyed. The Americans had lost fewer than 30 Hellcats in air combat. The ratio was better than 10-1. That evening, a pilot named Cy Elford looked at the carnage they had inflicted and shook his head in amazement. "It was just like an old-time turkey shoot," he said. The nickname stuck. The Battle of the Philippine Sea became known forever as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The implications were devastating for Japan. The cream of their naval air force had been destroyed. The pilots were gone. The aircraft were gone. The carriers were damaged or sunk. Japan's ability to conduct offensive naval air operations was finished. The next day, June 20th, 1944, American search planes found the retreating Japanese fleet. Mitchell faced a difficult decision. The enemy was at extreme range, nearly 300 miles away. If he launched a strike now, his pilots would be flying into the setting sun. They would have to attack in failing light and return to the carriers in darkness. Many would not make it back. Mitchell launched anyway. 240 aircraft headed west, chasing the Japanese fleet. They found the enemy as the sun touched the horizon. In the fading light, American pilots dove on Japanese carriers, dropping bombs, firing torpedoes. They sank the carrier Hio and damaged 2 others. They shot down 65 more Japanese aircraft. Then they turned for home and the fuel gauges began to fall. The return flight became a desperate race against empty tanks and gathering darkness. Pilots called out their remaining fuel on the radio. Some ran out before reaching the fleet and ditched in the ocean. Others made it to the carriers but crashed trying to land in the dark. Mitchell made another decision that revealed his understanding of what mattered. He ordered every ship in the fleet to turn on its lights. Searchlights, deck lights, running lights, navigation lights. The entire task force lit up like a city in the middle of the ocean. It was a tremendous risk. Japanese submarines might be lurking nearby, but Mitchell was not going to let his pilots die trying to find their way home in the darkness. The lights saved dozens of lives. Pilots who would have run out of fuel searching in the darkness found the fleet and landed safely. Others ditched near the ships and were picked up by destroyers. Of the 80 aircraft lost that night, fewer than 20 pilots were killed. The rest were rescued. When the Battle of the Philippine Sea ended, the Japanese had lost over 600 aircraft and 3 aircraft carriers. 3 more carriers were damaged beyond quick repair. Their naval air power was crippled beyond recovery. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical losses. Japanese pilots who survived the battle returned with stories of unstoppable American fighters, of formations torn apart before they could reach their targets, of friends dying by the dozens, of a superiority so complete that it seemed impossible. The confidence that had carried Japanese naval aviation since Pearl Harbor was shattered. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese commanders faced an impossible situation. They could not replace the aircraft lost in battle quickly enough. More critically, they could not replace the pilots. The training programs that had produced the elite aviators of 1941 and 1942 no longer existed. Fuel shortages made extensive training impossible. There were not enough instructors. There was not enough time. The pilots being sent into combat now had barely enough skill to take off and land. Asking them to fight Hellcats in conventional air combat was sending them to certain death. So Japanese commanders stopped asking them to survive. 4 months after the Philippine Sea, the first organized kamikaze attacks began. Pilots would no longer try to survive their missions. They would crash their aircraft into American ships, killing themselves to damage the enemy. It was an admission of defeat. Japan could no longer compete in conventional air combat. The Hellcat had made that impossible. Commander David McCampbell continued flying after the Philippine Sea. On October 24, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf in the Philippines, he encountered a formation of 60 Japanese aircraft heading for the American fleet. McCampbell and his wingman, Ensign Roy Rushing, were the only fighters in position to intercept. The odds were 30-1. Any sane pilot would have called for reinforcements and waited for support. McCampbell attacked immediately. For 90 minutes, McCampbell and Rushing dove through the Japanese formation, firing, climbing, diving again. They worked as a team, protecting each other, calling out targets. McCampbell shot down 9 aircraft, 7 Zeros and 2 Oscars. Rushing got 6 more. 15 enemy aircraft destroyed by 2 American pilots. The Japanese formation broke up. The survivors scattered without reaching the fleet. When McCampbell finally landed, it was not on his own carrier. The flight deck of the USS Essex was not clear. He put down on the USS Langley instead. His guns had 2 rounds of ammunition remaining. His fuel tanks were empty. The aircraft had to be pushed off the arresting wire by hand because there was not enough fuel to taxi. 9 kills in a single mission a record that still stands today. McCampbell finished the war with 34 confirmed victories, all of them in Hellcats. He received the Medal of Honor for his actions at the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. He was the only fast carrier pilot of World War II to receive the nation's highest military decoration. He was the Navy's ace of aces. Alexander Vraciu ended the war with 19 confirmed kills, all in Hellcats. He was shot down over the Philippines in December 1944, not by an enemy fighter, but by anti-aircraft fire during a strafing run. He parachuted safely and was rescued by Filipino guerrillas who hid him from the Japanese. They made him a major and gave him command of a guerrilla unit. He fought alongside them for 5 weeks until American forces arrived. Vraciu returned to the USS Lexington in time to see the war end. He stayed in the Navy after the war, served as a test pilot, commanded a fighter squadron, and retired as a commander in 1963. He died in January 2015 at the age of 96. Robert Duncan, the pilot who had scored the Hellcats' first kill against a Zero, finished the war with 7 confirmed victories. He flew combat missions in Korea after the war, completing over 100 missions across 2 conflicts. He retired from the Navy in 1966 with the rank of captain. In 1998, more than 50 years after his fight over Wake Island, Duncan learned something that astonished him. His second kill that morning, the Zero pilot who had tried the vertical climb maneuver, had been Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda, a 9-victory ace. Sueda had perfected the climbing trap. He had killed 9 American pilots with that maneuver. Duncan had not just defeated the tactic, he had killed one of its masters. The Hellcat had not just matched the Zero, it had destroyed the Zero's finest pilots. The F6F Hellcat remained in production until November 1945. In 30 months of production, Grumman built 12,275 aircraft. At peak production, they were rolling one off the assembly line every hour around the clock, 7 days a week. 20,000 workers labored in the Bethpage factory. Many of them were women who had never worked in manufacturing before the war. Those aircraft flew 66,530 combat sorties. They destroyed 5,155 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, plus an additional 8 during the invasion of southern France. They lost 270 Hellcats in air-to-air combat, a kill ratio of 19-1. Against the Zero specifically, the ratio was 13-1. Against the Nakajima Ki-84, one of Japan's best late-war fighters, it was 9.5-1. Against the Mitsubishi J2M, it was 3.7-1. The Hellcat dominated every opponent it faced. 305 American pilots became aces flying the Hellcat, more than any other aircraft in American history. The Hellcat accounted for 75% of all Navy and Marine Corps aerial victories in World War II. Only 42 American bombers and torpedo planes were lost to enemy aircraft, while under Hellcat escort between 1943 and 1945, 42 aircraft in 2 years of combat. The Hellcat did not just kill the enemy, it protected its own. After the war, the Hellcat faded quickly from service. Jet aircraft were already entering production. The propeller-driven fighters that had won the Pacific War were obsolete almost as soon as the fighting stopped. By 1950, most Hellcats had been transferred to training units or reserve squadrons. By 1954, the last were retired from frontline service, but the aircraft's legacy endured. It had not just defeated the Zero, it had destroyed Japanese air power completely. It had turned the Pacific sky from contested battleground to American domain. It had proven that American industry, American engineering, and American pilots could not just match their enemies, but overwhelm them. Today, only a handful of Hellcats remain. 7 are still airworthy, all of them in the United States. They appear at air shows and museum demonstrations. Their Pratt and Whitney engines still roar with the sound of 2,000 horses, their wings still casting shadows over crowds who never knew the war they won. At the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida, a Hellcat painted in David McCampbell's markings sits on display as a tribute to his achievements. 34 small Japanese flags are painted on its fuselage. Each one represents a pilot who never came home. Each one represents a family that received a telegram from the Navy Department. Each one represents a victory that helped end the war. The Hellcat was not the fastest fighter of World War II. It was not the most maneuverable. It was not the most technologically advanced. But it was the right aircraft at the right time, built in the right numbers, flown by the right pilots. It was designed to survive, to protect its pilots, to bring them home. And in doing so, it destroyed the enemy that had terrorized the Pacific for 18 months. Japanese pilots who survived the war remembered the Hellcat with a mixture of respect and dread. Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's greatest aces with 64 confirmed kills, described his encounters with Hellcats over Iwo Jima as the toughest dogfights of his career. He called the Hellcat one of the best aircraft he ever fought against. Other Japanese veterans were more direct. They had watched their squadrons torn apart by Hellcats at the Philippine Sea. They had seen comrades die in aircraft that could no longer compete. They had been forced to adopt suicide tactics because conventional combat was no longer survivable. The Hellcat had not just beaten them, it had broken them. The Zero had been designed for offense. Speed, climb, range, maneuverability, everything a pilot needed to find and destroy his enemies. But the men who designed it had assumed their pilots would do the killing. They had not planned for a war of attrition. They had not planned for an enemy who could replace losses faster than they could inflict them. They had not planned for the Hellcat. The Hellcat was designed for survival. Armor, firepower, ruggedness, simplicity, everything a pilot needed to fight, take damage, and come back to fight again. The nation that could keep its pilots alive, keep its aircraft flying, keep its factories producing, would eventually overwhelm the nation that could not. Japan lost that war long before the atomic bombs fell. They lost it over the Philippine Sea when 600 aircraft and thousands of airmen went into battle and did not come back. They lost it in the factories of Bethpage, New York, where American workers produced Hellcats by the thousands, while Japanese industry struggled to replace even modest losses. They lost it in the training schools of Pensacola and Corpus Christi, where American pilots received hundreds of hours of instruction while Japanese cadets were rushed to the front with barely enough skill to survive takeoff. The Hellcat did not win the Pacific War by itself, but it made victory possible. It cleared the sky so that American bombers could strike Japanese shipping, Japanese factories, Japanese cities. It protected the carriers that were the heart of American naval power. It destroyed the pilots who might have contested American advances. It turned air combat from a deadly gamble into a foregone conclusion, and it did all of this in less than 2 years. From first flight to final victory, from a factory in Long Island to the skies over Tokyo, from drawing board to legend. That is how victory is achieved. Not through single heroes or legendary machines alone, but through thousands of ordinary aircraft flown by thousands of ordinary pilots doing their jobs day after day. Through factories working around the clock. Through engineers solving problems. Through mechanics keeping aircraft flying. Through trainers preparing pilots. Through everyone doing their part. The Hellcat was America's answer to the Zero. It was bigger, heavier, less elegant, less refined. It was built by workers who had never made aircraft before, flown by pilots who learned to fight in months rather than years. But it was the right answer. And the Japanese pilots who faced it learned to fear a simple truth that changed the Pacific War. The hunters had become the hunted.